Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice, I want to welcome all of you to the 2025 Sol Kanee Lecture on Peace and Justice. This year's lecture will have a very different format than usual, but it'll be a very nice format. Today's lecture will feature two senior leaders from Oxfam Canada, Ravon, Oxfam Canada's Executive Director, and Deputy Director-Humanitarian Dalia Al-Awqati. Together, they will address the disturbing reality of today: forced migration and internal displacement. Before we begin, I wish to note that this land upon which the Canadian Museum for Human Rights is built and that the city of Winnipeg sit at the crossroads of the Anishinaabe, Métis, Cree, Dakota, and Anishinaabe nations. As such, we acknowledge specifically that we're in Treaty 1 territory and on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe peoples and the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with Indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. The Sol Kanee Lecture Series on Peace Building is supported by the generosity of the Richardson Foundation and Richardson family of Winnipeg. We are grateful for their contribution to our Morrow Institute and this lecture series. As well, we extend our thanks to the leadership of members of the Winnipeg community, most especially Mr. Sol Kanee, who is an ardent champion of peace building and human rights and for whom this lecture is named after. I wish to also acknowledge our Institute's benefactor, Dr. Arthur V. Morrow, along with the many others who have contributed to the work of the Morrow Institute and of the faculty and students enrolled in the Peace and Conflict Studies program. Together, through all their efforts, we have opened the door for greater opportunities to know, understand, and walk in the path of peace. I also want to thank the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for opening up this venue for our work. We find ourselves partnering with them often, and we'll be partnering with them in 2027 in August when we host an International Peace Summit in this facility. I will now ask Dr. Stanley Amalatis, the Director of the Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice, to introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Good evening, welcome, bonsoir, et bienvenue. Now before I move along, Chris, I want to affirm and thank Dr. Chris Adams for his tremendous support for all that we do at the Morrow Institute for Peace and Justice. You know, I can always count on Dr. Adams to ask some very challenging questions about what we choose to do. But I also can count on him to walk and work alongside with us when he receives a reasonable response. So thank you, Chris, and above all, thank you for your quiet leadership. Again, thank you to the Canadian Museum for Human Rights for offering us this space for I guess it'll be a painful yet real happening in our world today. It is indeed a great honor to convene tonight to explore one of the defining challenges of our era, the global and disturbing trend of massive forced displacement, where more and more people around the world are being forced to flee their homes in search of safety. Across every region in the world, millions of people are being forced to leave their communities and jump into the unknown, not by choice, but to survive. And tonight, we will have a conversation with two leaders and practitioners who are passionately engaged in this very hard and sad reality, and hear what they have to say about the evolving contours of forced displacement, how new dynamics are changing those who are forced to flee, where they are going, for how long, under what conditions. We'll also explore with them how the world is responding and how Canada is stepping up to meet the moment. It is my pleasure to introduce to you Lauren Ravon, who is the Executive Director, and Dalia Al-Awqati, the Deputy Director. And our process this evening is going to be threefold. One, I'll invite Lauren and Dalia to say a few words, a little story about themselves, how they got to be here. And then we'll spend a few minutes having a conversation with them through a question and answer kind of exchange. And then finally, we'll turn it over to you, the audience, if you have any questions to have a conversation. And we have 2 mics, so I ask you to just approach any one of those mics at that time, okay? So let me call first on Lauren to share her personal experience, her story, within the context of her role with Oxfam Canada. Now, Lauren has worked on international human rights and humanitarian causes for the past 20 years. And she's an outspoken advocate for women's rights. Her bio is in your program, so I won't repeat that here. Suffice to say that prior to joining Oxfam, Lauren worked with the International Center for Human Rights and Democratic Development, Planned Parenthood International, and the International Rescue Committee. So, welcome, Lauren. The podium is yours.
I was just saying that as I walked into this room, I had this memory. I think the very last event that I did before the pandemic changed all of our lives was in this room. At Oxfam, we went across Canada, to cities across Canada, with something called Museum Without a Home, which was an exhibition of objects that refugee families had lent us or given us that symbolized their displacement. And sometimes it was a toy of a child, a book, a Bible, a fork even, and we displayed it throughout this room. And so they were everyday objects that had huge meaning for people who had been displaced. And I hadn't thought about that event in years, and as I walked in here, it all came back to me, and I remember the incredibly warm welcome that we had from the community here. So it was a beautiful event. I really cherish that memory. I don't think I'll say much about myself. I've been with Oxfam for many years now, and it's an organization that's really close to my heart. So maybe I can just say a few words about Oxfam if you're not aware of what the organization does. I mean, at our core, we're an organization that works to end poverty by fighting injustice. That's what we do. But I think what best describes us is the fact that as an organization, we do 3 things that others do, but separately, and we do these 3 things together. And I think that's what makes Oxfam unique and uniquely impactful in the very complicated world that we live in. So we support long-term development and community development programs in countries around the world, in about 80 countries. And that can be supporting women's empowerment through entrepreneurship. It can be agroecological techniques with farmers, developing civic space, building up civil society organizations, so that deep community work. We also respond to humanitarian emergencies. So that's large-scale programming to supply water, food, protection services for people who are undergoing the worst moments of their lives. And then the third thing that we do is that we do advocacy work. We are a very outspoken organization because we believe that everything else we do would just be turning in circles if we weren't addressing really the drivers of the inequality, the poverty, the conflicts that we're seeing around the world. So we speak up on a range of issues, from climate change to the arms trade, and a whole range of issues. And others do that, but rarely together. And so being able to both be in community, respond to crises, and actually speak truth to power, I think, is what makes Oxfam unique. And in this world that we're living in now, where our challenges are bigger and the political drivers behind poverty and inequality are very evident, we need organizations like Oxfam to actually be calling it out. So I would invite you to connect with us if you want to learn more about the organization. Maybe one last thing before I hand it back to you, Stanley. As I was reflecting and coming here thinking about the topic of forced displacement, there's something that has stayed with me. My very first job right out of university, I was working in Timor-Leste, what's known as East Timor previously. And I was there just a couple of years after independence, 2 years after independence, and the wounds of the conflict were still very, very deep. And I visited around the country, traveled quite a bit, and in so many places, you would see towns that had houses that were seemingly intact, that were empty, houses and houses, like ghost towns. And then on the outskirts of these towns, people were living in makeshift tents and really rudimentary shelters next to homes that were empty. And these were people who had been displaced, especially during the scorched earth policy in 1999, who had been able to come back to their villages, but there was such deep trauma related to violence that happened in those homes, whether it was killings, rapes, militia violence, such deep trauma and really unhealed wounds around lack of justice and accountability that people would not return to those homes. They would rather live in a tent, rather live outside than live in those actual buildings. And I share this story because it tells us what displacement means. It's one thing to be displaced. Returning to your home, you're never returning the way it was, if you do return. Displacement changes everything. It changes your connection to your land, to your community, to what you thought your future would be. And I think that symbol, like I still have it in my head, seeing those empty homes really symbolized that trauma of displacement that people had gone through. So I thought I would just start by sharing that.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you, Lauren. That must be hard, huh? To go back to emptiness. Dalia, your story. What brings you here? What brings you to this work?
It's a long story. It's many stories. It's a story that predates me. I am a recent immigrant to Canada. It's been almost 5 years, one of which is almost a year of citizenship. And a lot of times I find myself having to lead with that, whether it's starting at a new job. I've been with Oxfam Canada for about a year, actually exactly a year now. But also in my conversations with people, is that we come from very rich backgrounds, and I think a lot of times if you speak a particular way or say the right words, people take it for granted that this is everything you've known. I grew up in Kuwait. My father is Iraqi, my mother is Palestinian, and both of them were displaced. And they were different kinds of displaced, but they were both displaced, and they met in Kuwait. And they had, in Kuwait in the 80s, I would say. So the year I was born was the year the Iraq-Iran war started. And it was a war that shaped everything that we knew about Iraq. It was the war that meant my father basically spent 20 years without seeing one of his sisters. So I think it was 25 years before he saw her again. And my mother left shortly after Israel occupied Jerusalem and still went back, so we had those ties there. But I grew up during the war, the Iraq-Iran war. I grew up during the Intifada, and that really shaped a lot of my experience, seeing what it meant to be an Iraqi child, what it meant to be a Palestinian child, and then eventually getting displaced isn't the right word, but not being allowed or not being able to return to Kuwait during the Iraqi invasion. We were, and this probably speaks to privilege, but we were fortunate enough to miss it by 3 days. We went on vacation to Spain for the first time in years. And on the third day of vacation, this vacation that was meant to last 3 weeks, we heard the news as it was happening that the Iraqi tanks were rolling into Kuwait. And that meant that we couldn't go back because my father's Iraqi and displaced from there. The family that we were with could not go back because they too were Iraqi. And it sent us into a limbo of about 4 to 6 months before we landed in Jordan eventually. And only because the US asylum system and immigration system, both of them didn't work for us. We thought we were going to the US. We went to Jordan knowing my mom would go to Kuwait to get our personal items out of there. and our asylum visas were denied by the US Embassy in Jordan. And I think all of that together is really what drives me to particularly the humanitarian part of it, because I know that my experience is it's just so much easier than it has been for a lot of other people. It's easier because my parents had a good education. It's easier because we had family members that were in the diaspora on both sides that helped us out, that made sure that eventually we could go to school. And it was easier because at some point Jordan, at that time King Hussein, said, schools will be open to refugees. Schools will be open to people displaced from Kuwait, regardless of their nationality. And that's the only way we got into school. And it just pains me to see what's happening today, but it also drives me every day to make sure that whether it's here in Canada, whether it's around the world, that we're really supporting people as best we can across communities.
Thank you, Dalia. You know, so often we get so quick into institutional talk that we don't give ourselves the opportunity to hear the stories that you bring. So I thank you. Thank you for your stories. And you know, if we give ourselves an opportunity to hear somebody else's story, how can we hate them, right? We want to be in a relationship with them. So let's just take it a little deeper for yourselves in your work. Lauren, on what you shared, can you give us a sense of the scale of forced displacement and why it may look different today than it did in the past? And what do you see as patterns that are emerging today?
So I'll go into some background. Some of you might know. I'll try to set the stage for us. Right now, around the world, about 123 million people are displaced from their home, forcibly displaced. These are not people who are going looking for better opportunities. These are people who have had to flee their homes, 123 million. That's imagine it's as if 3 times the Canadian population was on the run on any given day. That's the scale of this. And I think what's important to note is that this has doubled in the last decade. So we're seeing kind of an exponential trend of displacement. About a half of those people are internally displaced. That means they've left the province, the region they lived in, often arriving in the outskirts of urban areas, though not exclusively, so lots of internal displacement. And then amongst them, there's about 47 million refugees around the world. Most of those refugees are hosted in the neighboring countries, so crossing a border and arriving in those countries. And I think contrary to the narrative that might be in the media and that we all hear, most refugees or displaced people end up in middle and low income countries, and about a quarter of all displaced people live in the least developed countries. So these are very vulnerable people who are landing in very poor communities. So when we talk about, you know, what is our ability, what is our intake ability, that really puts things in perspective. Most people are landing in very, very difficult conditions. You know, if you think of the countries that host the most refugees in the world today, or the most displaced, there'll be Iran, Turkey, right now have the most refugees. If you look at per capita, it would be Jordan and Lebanon, who have the highest concentration of displaced people within their countries. Now, what's driving this? I think that's the important part of the conversation. What we're seeing today is that there are more drivers, so more reasons why people have to flee their homes, and those reasons are more intense than they used to be. That's why we're seeing this acceleration of this phenomenon. I think the traditional drivers, if I'd ask any of you, you would probably say conflict and persecution. That's what has led people to be on the run traditionally. But that's changing today. So, you know, conflict is a major driver of displacement, but we're seeing that wars are lasting longer than they used to, and we have more protracted crises. So that means that, you know, a war could last 10, 20, 30 years, or some level of conflict in the country. And this helps explains why the average length of displacement is now 20 years. So this is not a case of a war breaks out and within a year you get home. These are long cycles of displacement. And as I was thinking of this, I wanted to share something with you. A couple of weeks ago, I was visiting our Oxfam teams in Lebanon and in Syria. And I visited a small, very small camp for Syrian refugees in Lebanon at the border of Syria. And I met with a group of women, young women. They were all, I'd say, in their early 20s. A group of women, and they all had beautiful, very young children, 2 or 3-year-olds running around. And the women told me that they had arrived at this little camp with very little services. They had arrived at that camp as children themselves. They had their babies in the camp, and as they were looking around, they said they expected that all of their daughters would have their own children in that camp. So these are cycles of displacement, of protracted displacement that we're talking about. It's not an in and out situation. Now, the other driver that has been a traditional driver, but that's also intensifying, is persecution. So people who are fleeing because they're discriminated against, there's threats against their lives, they're facing specific threats of violence in many cases, or just systemic exclusion. They have no space in their society. I don't see you here, but I was speaking to a man earlier at the reception who we were talking about the Rohingya refugee crisis. Some of you will know that back in 2017, the Rohingya people in Myanmar, in the Rakhine State, were intensely attacked and were forced to move, and they moved into Bangladesh. This was, in a very, very short amount of time, about 700,000 people who were on the move and seeking refuge in Bangladesh because of intense persecution. So those are some sorts of those movements of populations. But then increasingly, you can think of the LGBTQ community. So these are not large movements from one area, but individuals who are probably living in the one of 60 countries around the world where same-sex relationships are illegal or sometimes punishable by death. So we're seeing more and more LGBTQ people looking for refuge. And in these trajectories of displacement, whether it's because you're persecuted because of your religious identity, your sexual orientation, these people face more risks and more violence in the process of seeking refuge. There's a lot more risks along the way. So these are kind of the traditional drivers of displacement, but now there's others that I was going to mention, and they're increasingly prominent. So some of you might think of displacement around economic opportunity, families who are looking for a better future, opportunities for their kids. That's migration, and that exists. But what we're now seeing is economic desperation forcing people to flee. So this means people who can no longer feed their children. This is major economic desperation. And this is increasingly pushing people out. So if you think of, for example, Venezuela, about a quarter of the country has been displaced, a quarter of the people have left. And in large part, it's because of massive economic crisis, hyperinflation, no jobs where people literally could no longer put food on the table and were forced to flee. And then the last driver that I'll mention is climate change. This is something that we weren't seeing as a driver 20 or 30 years ago. And now Oxfam research shows that by 2050, it could be the main driver of displacement around the world. It could double the amount of people who are on the move. And there's two types of kind of climate-induced displacement. There's when there's massive extreme weather events, so a hurricane, a flood, where people have to leave their homes because they've been so damaged, but also climate change that's making some parts of our world almost uninhabitable. So if we think of East Africa and Central Africa, where there's been repeated droughts in the past few years. Pastoral communities have lost their livestock. They cannot live on this land anymore. There isn't water, there isn't a means of subsistence. You can also think of people in the Pacific Island nations, countries that are very vulnerable to climate change, who fear that their own country will literally no longer exist. There's starting to be conversations for asylum of entire countries. So this climate-induced displacement is ramping up. And when I mentioned earlier why Oxfam talks about and why we do advocacy work, it's to be able to connect the dots between things like displacement, climate change, and the responsibilities of countries like Canada to take action on climate. Do I have another minute?
Sure.
Yeah?
Absolutely.
I would also just say how things are really changing, because displacement isn't new, but there are trends that are definitely changing. So as I mentioned earlier, some of these are new, climate change, but I think something that's most important to note is that displacement more and more is multi-causal. So it's not just one reason. For example, if you think of Sudan today, people are fleeing violence, so just war and violence. They might be fleeing persecution because of who they are or what region of the country they live in. There's also climate disasters, so drought that is forcing people to flee. There's no longer way of living because you can't make a living because of the drought and the impact on agriculture. And then you have economic collapse on top of it. So the more there are causes of displacement, the less linear it will be to have a path to return. It's not like you can solve one of the problems and everyone can go back home when there's multiple reasons. Something that really, one of those moments that really strikes you, when I was in Syria a couple of weeks ago, I was speaking to someone, a local leader in Aleppo, and everything was rubble around us, everything. And I was asking him, what was the biggest challenge for reconstruction for his community? And he said, climate change. And it was one of those moments where we had been talking about demining and rebuilding, and then he said climate change. So it tells you, even if there's one problem that's been addressed, there's these multiple factors that keep people from returning to where they want to be in their homes. We're also seeing new trends of repeated displacement. So I think last year I was visiting Oxfam's large-scale humanitarian operations at the border between Sudan and South Sudan. And that's a place where you have Sudanese refugees that are coming into South Sudan, fleeing conflict, but you also have South Sudanese returnees who had fled to Sudan because they were facing persecution in South Sudan and now are coming back. But the conditions that force them to flee aren't resolved. So these are people who are extremely vulnerable and staying at the border. So you're in this limbo, neither country is safe for you. So, returnees and refugees all in this cycle of displacement. I mentioned it earlier, but we're also seeing more and more displacement kind of around urban settings, which creates all these new challenges because organizations like Oxfam, the Canadian Food Grains Bank, and others who are used to doing humanitarian operations, it's often in the setting of camps. Whereas if it's in urban areas or around urban setting, it's much harder to access people and to provide basic services. So it changes what humanitarian response looks like. And then there's this, I was saying that most people who are displaced are within their region, so just have crossed the border and are near a neighboring country. We're seeing these trends where people have been displaced and then they're in limbo. So if you think of the Rohingya population, it's now about 1 million people in Bangladesh, in a very small area of Bangladesh called Cox's Bazar. People have been there since 2017, and there's really no exit in sight. Bangladesh hasn't signed on to the Refugee Convention, doesn't recognize them as refugees, won't allow them to integrate into society, so to get jobs and education. The violence and the threats are still very real back in Myanmar, so it's 1 million people who are in limbo, in that state of in-between. And then we're seeing kind of these cycles of displacement where the children will be born stateless and not have access to education. So a very concerning trend if we're looking for the long term. Maybe two last points. Another trend that we're seeing is increasing disregard for international law and international humanitarian law. So there's always been targeting of civilians in conflict, but now we're seeing intense targeting of civilians and lack of accountability for that. And this is very worrisome because this is driving massive displacement. The most obvious example that comes to mind today is in Gaza, where we haven't seen accountability for forced displacement and the deliberate targeting of civilians. So this creates new dynamics that we need to be addressing. And then finally, I mentioned it before, but we're seeing the early signs of massive levels of climate-induced displacement, which could really change everything when it comes to displacement. It could outpace conflict, persecution. That could be the one disruption added to the mix. I'll stop. That was a lot in one go.
That was a lot. How do you spell human desperation? That's sad. And you know, I think it kind of brings us to the next question that we had talked about. It's that in the midst of the story you're telling about what's going on, story of displacement, protracted displacement, high levels of desperation. Seems our attitude here towards, and our public sentiment towards refugees, migrants, significantly changing. And it led Pope Francis, for example, to speak to a world of indifference and our attitude of indifference, right? Especially to the marginalized and those who are forced to leave. So, Dalia, can you give us a granular view of what it means to be displaced? I think Lauren has already touched on several of those points. And can you speak to some of the common misconceptions that people might have about migration and the realities of people who have been forced to flee? But I think Lauren has already touched on that. But just your sense of the misconceptions that people have.
Absolutely. I think the first thing that I want to focus, just to reiterate, is this notion of displacement is linear. It really isn't. It's not straight from your home to a different country, not for most people. I think about many of the places where I've worked, and it was from, for a lot of people, it was from your home to your parents' home, to your cousin's home, and a couple more times before you even left your city or your town. And the reality is, both for displacement but also for humanitarian crises, there's not this one, well, I would say maybe for the most part, but almost for every crisis, there's not this one point where it's just like, okay, now we've packed up and it's done and it's ended. That's not the reality. Not because we don't hear about it in the news, not because a political agreement has been signed, although we see less and less of those, to be quite frank, these days. A great example of that is the Rohingya crisis. It doesn't end because we don't hear about it. It continues, and the experience of displacement continues. And some of I think just trying to be in the shoes of the people who are having to make those choices look very, very different for every single person and every family unit. And it starts with, can we leave? Is there somewhere to go? Is everyone coming with me? Because a lot of the places where we go and a lot of the people that we think about, we're not thinking about individual units. And the reality is, if you were forced to flee, you're not thinking about yourself alone. You're thinking about your partner, you're thinking about children, you're thinking about parents, the people who you love, the people who are close to you, who either you are responsible for or are responsible for you. And that's the starting decision. That's the starting point of, can I go, and who can come with me? And if they do not want to come with me, what do I do? Do I stay or not? The whole process is, we think about it sometimes as, it's depicted as physical hardship. And yes, displacement is physical hardship, but it is also a lot of psychological hardship. I come from a background of displacement. I come from communities. I'm not thinking just of my own families, but I grew up in Jordan, and Jordan hosts Palestinians, Jordan hosts Syrians, Jordan hosts Iraqis. These are just some of the main ones. We have hosted people displaced from Lebanon for months at a time as well. But I recently read a statistic that there are over 40 nationalities of asylum seekers and refugees in Jordan. It really does look different for every single one of them. And I bet you that not one of them left thinking, I will never come back to my home. Not one of them left thinking, okay, I'm fine, I'll be back soon in and I'm okay to leave this. So this psychological difficulty of just making that choice to leave your home to the unknown is really, really great. And along the way, some of the things that you meet, and this is part of the humanitarian programming that we do, are protection issues, your safety. Is it guaranteed? Absolutely not. There are no guarantees on safety, and I think every displaced person knows that. And a lot of it is because of the flaunting of international humanitarian law. But you also have specific dangers and risks that exist for women, for people that are elderly, and for children. And again, that looks different per family unit, but a lot of times as displacement happens, you'll see that in many cases, the children are sent, the women and the children may be sent first, and then the men will follow. Will you have services where you go? You're leaving a difficult situation, but where you're going, are you going to be able to feed yourself? And I say it as yourself, but really the question is always, are you going to be able to feed your kids? Are you going to be able to provide, are you going to find the medical or the health services that you need for your father-in-law, for your mother-in-law? These are all, they seem like decisions that we honestly take for granted every day, but these are just some of the hundreds of decisions that every displaced family and every displaced person has to make. And they have to take them multiple times. So as I think about, I'll lean on the Syria crisis. I spent 4 years working on the Syria crisis, working with people that are refugees in 2 different countries, working with people that are internally displaced. It was about 7 to 8 displacements before they crossed an international border. 7 or 8 times that they had to make these exact decisions. And even for my family, during the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait, we had to make those, a set of those decisions about 3 to 4 times before we finally decided our only choice was to stay in Jordan. That was the only realistic choice for that. I think I'll just close it with saying, you know, I think really we have to have a lot of empathy for people. I think we deserve it as our own people, but also other people around the world. And we have to remember that you can't really paint people with this just one stroke. And this is the biggest thing that I see working in host countries, working in host communities, even when people are internally displaced, and also having lived in the US and now in Canada, is sometimes we want to paint a picture that fits our narrative. And we paint large groups of people in this just one dimension that we want to see. And that is just not the reality of who people are. We're not that way. I'm not that way as a Canadian citizen now, but I wasn't that way 10 years ago or 20 years ago either. And I think that's something that we constantly have to remember, is that people have been through really rough times. They've done everything that they have to do to reach safety for the people that they care about. And they will continue to do whatever it takes to be productive, contributing members of their communities. I don't say society, I don't say a country, but that is really what matters to people. The sense of community for a lot of actually most of the places I've worked in at least 15, it was the sense of community. And they bring that community, displaced people bring that community anywhere that they go. And that's exactly what we do. So I think just remembering that we're not all the same. And that experience is incredibly rich, and it brings with it so much knowledge, so much practice that we really can benefit from.
And you know, I think this is why we do the work we do. Not to spread desperation, but this is definitely not a technical issue. And in the West, I think right now we're so concerned with AI and the effects of AI. But what you bring to this conversation is you're instilling, at least in me, a desire to feel the need to act, to feel the need to act. Because I think you might agree with me that when I say that if nothing is felt, nothing matters. So thank you for at least raising the bar for us to kind of think about what matters in our human lives. And so I see the future is equality as Oxfam. And so Oxfam has framed global displacement as a driver of inequality. Can you unpack that for us, Lauren?
Yeah, so I guess this comes back to what I started with on kind of the advocacy work that Oxfam does. And part of our work is responding to people's immediate needs, water, food in the moment that actually saves lives. But I would say, just as importantly, it's speaking out about this and saying, forced displacement, humanitarian crisis, this is not just a humanitarian issue. It is ultimately an issue of power and justice and inequality. And we need to center that, because if not, we're not getting to the heart of the problem. And we see, global displacement both as a symptom of inequality, the inequality in this world, and also something that's driving more inequality. So it's going in both directions. I think as a symptom of inequality, we can look to the fact that, as I was mentioning at the beginning, about 75% of people who are displaced are landing in communities that don't have the means to support them. So that means that this is a symptom of inequality where people who are very vulnerable are landing in communities that are also very vulnerable. In particular around climate change and the impact of climate change on displacement. Here we really see it very clearly. We see that, and Oxfam has done a lot of research on this, but people in poor countries are 5 times more likely to be directly impacted by climate-induced disasters. And it's not just because their countries are more susceptible to this, but if you're living in poverty, if you're excluded, if you're marginalized, you have less means to cope. So for example, if my apartment in Montreal is flooded in a storm and I lose my apartment, I might have insurance, I might have a social safety net, community infrastructure. If you're living in a community that's in poverty, you don't have the means to bounce back. And so this is where we talk about inequality as a driver of displacement. Over the last few years, we've done a lot of advocacy work, including with people in this room, to draw attention to the droughts, the climate-induced droughts in the Horn of Africa and East Africa. And I want to come back to this because it really shows kind of the level of inequality. In many communities, people are pastoralists, so you might have, let's say, a herd of 10 cows. If all 10 die out because of the drought and you cannot feed your cattle, you have nothing left. There is no insurance, there's no way to purchase new livestock. That is it. You have no livelihood left. You have to leave. There's nothing that is going to keep you surviving on that land. And so this is really that symptom of inequality where people don't have those safety nets, that insurance, those even banking mechanisms, for example. Then on the flip side of this, we see how mass displacement entrenches inequalities that already exist but make things worse. In a way, it's like you're putting a magnifying glass. You're seeing inequalities that were already there that are multiplied. So for example, people who already might have had limited rights to begin with, then they cross over a border, they're living in limbo. I mentioned countries that don't recognize the Refugee Convention, that don't recognize refugee rights. The Syrian women that I mentioned to you who are living at the border in Lebanon that I met with, who had their children with them. I was asking them, how are they making ends meet? They're only allowed to work as day laborers on farms on very specific jobs, the least paid jobs. That is the only path for not even employment, for a little revenue. So these are keeping people trapped, and then their children won't have access to education and will be trapped further into a cycle of poverty. So that's how we talk about intergenerational impacts of inequality. Children who might be born stateless, who won't have access to education, who won't have further prospects, so entrenching those inequalities. We also see it on gender. The pathways of displacement are much more dangerous for women and girls and can create deeper gender inequality. So for example, we're seeing not only violence against women, gender-based violence in pathways of displacement, which is very real, also seeing trafficking, but also seeing very harmful coping mechanisms like child marriage. where families will decide to marry their daughters as a survival mechanism, further entrenching a cycle where women have children very young and don't have access to education. So again, linked to displacement. And so I think for Oxfam, what we try to focus on is both sides of it, to say the only way to actually address this trend of global displacement is to tackle inequalities at the source. You have to be investing in women's rights, investing in LGBTQ rights and communities, tackling climate change. You have to be addressing those drivers. And then on the flip side, our response to displacement needs to have inequality in mind. You have to figure out ways not only to help people survive day to day, but also flip the script, change those inequalities, provide access, focus on education, focus on women's rights trainings and camps and in displacement paths to be addressing what has driven this in the first place. So yeah, I think for us, it's really looking beyond the humanitarian issue to talk about the deep power imbalances that are at play.
So Dalia, can you add a little more? So how Oxfam is adapting to this reality that Lauren has just been outlining for us?
We do it in a few different ways. I can tell you best from the programming aspects. We often work within really rigid guidelines. And our systems still define things from a very siloed, one-dimensional lens. But what we do is we're in constant conversations. We're in constant conversations with people that design the system, the humanitarian ecosystem, but also the communities that we work in, to make sure that we're understanding what they see as needs. And I think that's a really important part, and it's a part that we overlook a lot. And actually people in general overlook a lot. It took about 20 years for us for the light bulb to go off across the sector, be like, oh, we should probably be asking the people what they want. How surprising. But we do that. We work with local organizations. We work very closely, I would say very closely across all our countries with local organizations and national organizations so that they're a better position to serve, well, first of all, to meet the needs within their own communities, but more importantly, to advocate for better systems and more just systems, both in their countries and across regions as well and internationally. But when I want to come back to this issue of systems, and because I know we want to talk about durable solutions as well. According to identified durable solutions for forcibly displaced people, there are 3 durable solutions, and one of them is return, one of them is resettlement, and the other one is integration or naturalization. And as Lauren told us, there's 123 million people that have been forcibly displaced as of end of 2024. Of those 123 million, almost a little over 277,000 of them were resettled or naturalized. That is nothing. That is really, it doesn't even come out to a percentage. I tried to do the math. And what it tells us is that doesn't work. It doesn't work for a couple of reasons. And one of those reasons is 2024 was also the largest year for returnees. So around 1.6 million people returned to their countries of origin, not necessarily to their communities of origin. Those countries were Afghanistan, Syria, South Sudan, and I will remember and Ukraine, sorry. So places, and this again was in 2024, so places where we know there hasn't been a marked improvement in living conditions, where the dangers that they fled still exist, which tells us that they fled even worse dangers while seeking asylum internationally, while coming from host countries. That the people we were talking about that returned to South Sudan were returning because the situation in Sudan was so abhorrent and continues to be so abhorrent, where the Afghans that returned to Afghanistan were being returned by force. They were actually being forcibly returned from at least one of the countries, if not 2 of the host countries. And for Ukrainians going back to Ukraine, it's because their means for durable solutions were also running out. And the same is for Syria. The same was for Syria in 2024, and there are many Syrians today that do not want to return. Maybe not a majority, but still significant numbers of Syrian refugees, both in the region and around the world. And we know that those durable solutions, that framing of durable solutions, no longer works. It doesn't apply. Because when the number of forcibly displaced people has more than doubled in a decade, it means that our conflicts are, well, our drivers are bigger. We're having more and more compounded crises, more and more drivers and newer drivers showing up. But also the reasons that people are being forced to be displaced aren't being addressed. So technology has advanced, and we often talk about that in such a positive sense. But it's that same technology that's fueling conflict and fueling war, and that's being used to create these more gruesome wars, these smarter, more destructive wars, both from a civilian perspective, but also from an infrastructure perspective. There's nothing to go back to. We know that climate is becoming more and more of a driver, and that is not being addressed. And it's not humanitarian programming that's going to address it. It's actually global willpower. It is making its decisions, and it's protecting people that are most vulnerable to it. And like we said earlier, just because we don't hear about it, it doesn't mean it's not happening. So for us to really talk about durable solutions, I think we really have to reimagine what that looks like today. And it can't exist. We cannot have durable solutions without actually addressing drivers. And I think that has been the biggest gap in just the conversation about durable solutions. And a gap that we're constantly trying to address through our inequality work, through our climate justice work, and also, of course, through our adherence to international rules and norms.
So we'll have two more questions, and then we'll turn it on to you. Let's talk about Canada. I mean, we are geographically isolated. We're not in the front line. We're not there at the borders receiving the displaced. And we are in the middle of a presidency that throws tantrums, that's in the south. What can Canada do? What is Canada doing at the moment and in the moment?
Canada could be doing a lot more. We know this, but we also are in a moment of kind of national consciousness, who we are, how are we different than the United States, what makes us specifically Canadian. This can be something that we unite around. I was mentioning that most people are displaced land in the poorest countries. The idea that we cannot afford, our systems cannot afford to have more people is just not true. It's not just a matter of fair share. We don't proportionally welcome our fair share of people who are forced to flee. But just before coming, Dalia and I were having a conversation on the notion of fair share, because often, Oxfam, we've calculated, the number of people proportionally that Canada should be receiving. But it needs to be weighted in a way. It's not only proportional to our population, but proportional to our means. And if you consider the capacity of South Sudan to host refugees from Sudan, and our capacity can't be calculated in the same way. So there's definitely more in terms of intake that we can have, and we've done this well. The rapid resettlement of Syrian refugees in Canada is a very good example of how we can coordinate and act fast. And with the private sponsorship, we saw real kind of linkages between refugees and Canadian community. And it's a beautiful example, and some that people around the world saw that real integration between the host communities and refugees. So there's lots of examples that we can build on. My concern today is that there's a tendency to other people to look for scapegoats. I'm sure you've turned on the news recently, keep hearing how it's refugees who are causing our housing crisis. refugees who are causing an increase in violence, people who have been forced to flee are somehow the cause of our crumbling social infrastructure. We cannot lean into that. That is incredibly dangerous. It's not factual, but it's also so dangerous. And at Oxfam, we've been pushing back and calling out some new legislation that really is looking to crack down on the right to asylum that exists and that Canada is a party to. So like Bill C2, C12, these are bills that can be very dangerous because they're more about enforcing controls and limiting access for people who have the right to claim asylum, invoking our fears in this moment, our fears for our security, for our economic safety, and that's not the direction that Canada should be taking. And it's normal that Canadians feel fearful in this moment. We need to recognize that and say the other is not our enemy, and we can do both things. We can build a safe and prosperous Canada and welcome people into this country. We can absolutely do both together. I think in terms of recommendations, there's a couple that Oxfam has been sharing with the Government of Canada and just speaking out on. The first is this idea of responsibility sharing, that if a country like Bangladesh or like Uganda can be welcoming so many people, so can we. And especially in a moment where there's such a vacuum of positive, progressive leadership in the world, where we're seeing the United States close its doors, this can be something that can be very positive for us to be signaling on the world stage. I think we need to also look at how do we welcome people without discrimination, and that's such an important thing to call out. We saw, and I will say it very bluntly, the way Canada has opened its doors to refugees coming from Ukraine and has not had the same welcome to refugees coming from Africa, to refugees who could possibly come from Gaza. There is still a double standard in how we set up asylum programs and rapid resettlement programs, and we need to call out that discrimination for what it is. It is racism, and that has no part to play in how we build a welcoming society. I think we need to continue speaking out about bills that are used to scapegoat others instead of dealing with our own problems at home. So I mentioned Bill C2, C12, but other attempts like that. I think Canada also has a huge role to play in just speaking up on international law, human rights, international humanitarian law. We need to continue to say those things matter. In a few instances of the past year or two, people have asked me, why is Oxfam so focused on what's happening in Gaza? Why do you speak so much about crimes being committed in Gaza while there's crimes being committed in so many countries? And my answer is always yes, but if we're not calling out international humanitarian law violations in that instance, because it's a country that's an ally, then any other country can get away with crimes. We need to be holding firm, and Canada can't uphold international law when it suits it and when it doesn't. And now is a moment to reaffirm it, because international law is under immense threat. And the whole system of international human rights that we've built up over decades could crumble if people don't stand for it. It's only a piece of paper. It's only worth what we make it worth. And so we really need Canada to be speaking up for international human rights. I would also say there's a real importance for Canada to continue to be investing in international aid and humanitarian aid in this moment. I cannot overstate how impactful President Trump's decision to cut all USAID funding has been. We've lost about 40% of all humanitarian funding around the world. And that has impacts everywhere. That means that, children won't be vaccinated, kids won't be going to schools, basic humanitarian infrastructure is being dismantled. This is a time where Canada can be stepping up, and in particular, doing it through the lens of equality. So really addressing the inequalities and the power imbalances that force people to flee. This should be at the heart of our international cooperation. And then finally, and it might seem somewhat disconnected, but we need to be looking here at home as one of the most polluting countries in the world at our emissions, at our climate financing, and doing our part. Climate change is going to wreak havoc on the world, and those who are most vulnerable are going to be on the run. Whether it is your island actually disappearing because the water is rising, or because as far as you can see, there is no water to be had. This is the result of climate change, and As a very high polluting country, we need to get our emissions under control because it's the humanitarian thing to do, it's the right thing to do, and it's a matter of justice.
You know, I could feel the passion. I could feel the passion in you, Dalia, Lauren, and which moves me, I think, away from feeling desperate or the feeling of desperation to one of hope. So if you could share your experience of an example of leadership, innovation, or resilience that you witnessed amongst the displaced population with the communities you work with. Perhaps that could trigger in us the work that we need to do to address this issue, right?
Happily. I was going to share two examples from Syria, but I'll actually start with one from South Sudan. I feel a little inspired by some of the conversations we had. I was in South Sudan in 2017, and different parts of the country were experiencing famine. And in the one part that I was in Southern Unity State, the famine was picking up bad enough that we had to set up what we call stabilization centers in some of the main towns. The villages around the towns were so far. It took, it was an hour-and-a-half drive on really difficult terrain. I can't call it roads. But on one of those drives, we were trying to set up a mobile unit and felt like the middle of nowhere, not a lot of people in sight. We sat and we waited, and the community came out. And I was actually the team leader for my team at the time. And the women, the South Sudanese women in this little community, this little very remote community, were so happy to see a woman that was leading a team, and their enthusiasm for the space that we wanted to set up that we could go to 3 times a week was so extensive that they committed alongside the men in their community to actually set it up with their own resources, with their own time, that they would not accept any kind of payment to set up the physical space that we would then staff. And that's just one small example in a place where your average person would look and say, what is it that they really have to give? And they gave us a warm welcome. They gave us a space because it wasn't just for their community. It was for about 4 other communities that would come there, and the children from those communities. They gave us the little resources that they have. And again, we are so consumed with, do we have enough, that sometimes in our moments of biggest need, we find that we have a lot more than we realized. And I also want to share this story, it's something small that one of my coworkers from my time in Turkey did. I worked with this lovely Syrian agronomist. His thing was seeds and agriculture. He was a former professor at the University of Idlib. He was displaced from Idlib province to Aleppo several times before he crossed that border into Turkey. And he looked at the food assistance that we were providing to some of the settlements. So these are informal camps that were individually set up and grew by people that were displaced by the fighting and the airstrikes. And he found that the food that we were providing, of course, didn't include enough fresh produce because it included none. It had to be trucked across the border. And he wasn't happy with the nutritious composition. He looked at us and he said, you know, this really lacks protein. They're not gonna find chicken, they're not gonna find meat. And he set off on weeks of exploration to find the right mushrooms. The right mushrooms that that community would know how to use, to find the seeds for those mushrooms, and to create this little, think of it as an IKEA type of package of mushrooms, soil, and a container that was scalable, that he actually really developed, got our whole logistics team of 20 people to commit to. And we started shipping across that border so that women were able to grow mushrooms for their children and could meet some of those nutrition requirements that he really wanted us to get. Weeks of work. Incredible, incredible work. I can't speak highly enough about him. And today, he's gone back to Syria. He continues to do more broadly humanitarian work. But every community he goes to, every couple of months, he's like, Dalia, I've just been to this place and it's really incredible and this is what we were able to bring. It's not we were able to give them a food kit. He's like, oh no, I reintroduced this particular seed or this particular plant into a community after it's been gone for 5 years, for 10 years. And this is just one example. There are thousands of people, millions of people out there like that. But we don't get those stories. We don't get that side of people. Because a lot of times we just don't ask. And I love seeing that everywhere that we go and every other person that we work with.
Well, I, for one, will not be able to relate to a mushroom in the same way now, right? Who could have thunk? And you know, folks, we'll turn it over to you. We'll turn it over to you now. If you have any questions, please, or comments, or statements, or reflections, please, we've got a microphone right back here. Please, anyone. Thank you. Just state your name and ask your question.
Thank you, Stan. Is this on? Yes, okay. Zane Zalis is my name, and I want to thank you very much for coming here and sharing your stories, your insights, your experience. It prods me, provokes me in many ways that are deeply moving. And to hear it from you, to reinforce some things that maybe we've heard before, but in ways so empathic and so compassionate that, yes, I will think of mushrooms differently, but I will also remember this very well, too. Let's see if I can get this right. First of all, thank you both. I'm hearing a lot, and you're doing a lot, and I'm so proud of what Oxfam does, Oxfam Canada does, and what you two and your teams have done. It really is inspiring. And I hear a lot about drivers. I've heard a lot about drivers. And I've heard a lot about the law, humanitarian law. But in my life and my personal experiences, I've never come across an event in a human condition or human relation where I found that you can legislate or compute compassion or empathy. And the drivers and everything you're doing is so important, so important, changing lives. But doesn't change the most fundamental driver of all, difference, others, and otherness. We have an inherent fear, in my experiences, when we see things we don't recognize. And you can say whatever you want in your legislature, you can bring down the courts and all you want, you cannot force me to embrace someone else. You just can't, or any human being in this room. So for me, hate and fear are at the bottom of everything. Seeking power is probably something to do with some fear of being less than, to be honest with you. So after all that, here's my question. I hope it's framed nicely. Because I think you have the capacity to, and maybe you're doing this already. What can Oxfam do to address bringing people together in face-to-face confrontations? Because I'm a believer in Emmanuel Levinas's philosophies that we see ourselves through the eyes of others, or the universe through the eyes of others. So yes, we keep the body well, we give food and we give hope. But the greatest one is when I can see a stranger or otherness and I'm not afraid. I'm willing to talk. What can Oxfam do to approach that problem or concern? Or maybe you're doing it already. But I really want to know. Thank you.
Thank you, Zane.
Thank you. That was a really beautifully framed question. Thank you. I appreciate that. I can't pretend that we have the magic solution, but we have probably the solution that comes closest to the magic solution, which is investing in women peace building, in women's rights organizations. I can't remember the source, but there's a very interesting study that was done over 50 countries that showed that countries where there was a strong women's movement, where women's rights organizations had a strong role to play in the society, there was less levels of displacement, less levels of violence, better economic outcomes. And so a lot of what we do in terms of our work is advocating for women's rights, women's leadership in peace negotiations, but also in humanitarian settings. Our kind of inside joke, disparagingly, we often call the humanitarian sector the boys in shorts. You can imagine expatriate young men running in to save people in far-off countries. We at Oxfam don't work that way. We don't want to send in the boys in shorts. We work only with local communities and increasingly with women's rights organizations. And women's rights organizations have been totally discounted as humanitarian actors because they're not perceived as technical, they're not perceived as being able to scale up the response. And yet, if you needed to get a child out of a burning building or a child fed in the midst of a famine, you would turn to women in the community. Women are always the first responders. And so more and more we're working with women's rights organizations, and we do see those connections. I'm not saying that investing in women is the only solution, but it's a big one. And I was thinking about, Stanley, your question about things that are hopeful, and this is bringing something to mind. We often see tensions between host communities and displaced people. In Canada, in every country, to your point, that there's a distrust of others. And because a lot of displaced people are landing in very poor communities to begin with, there's a sense of scarcity, so that it creates even more tension. And right after 2017, when the Rohingya arrived at the camps in Bangladesh, I was there with Oxfam's humanitarian response. And there was one thing that I witnessed that was incredibly beautiful. So there were already starting to be tensions with the local community because, a million people showing up in your backyard shakes things up significantly. A lot of the Rohingya women had fled so suddenly that they literally didn't have clothes with them. They didn't have headscarves. And in the camps, many of the women were staying in tents. It felt like a gazillion degrees in these tents because they no longer had their headscarves and so wouldn't go out in the community. And through the local women's rights organization that Oxfam was supporting, there was a project with Rohingya refugee women and local seamstresses to create garments for women in the camps. And that was a moment where the women came together to work on sewing together. It was incredibly beautiful. Communities that, if you listen to the men, were in direct confrontation, and the women were working together because they were recognizing a shared need. And it was an economic opportunity for some and an opportunity to provide dignity to the women in the camps. And so, I don't think that the traditional humanitarian system would see working with seamstresses to create headscarves as a humanitarian response, and yet that was creating community and dignity in a place where people desperately needed that sense of dignity. A partial answer.
Thank you. Dalia, you spoke about women leadership in your story, and you're speaking about investing in women and women's rights. So a little plug here. Next week, for example, we're having Sister Laura from Brazil, and she's a firm believer that women are at the heart of justice. And so she will be coming out to speak to us from Brazil next week at St. Paul's College, and the challenges that they themselves are facing, the indigenous population, and the disrespect for our climate and our resources. So if you are able to come, I'd like to invite each and every one of you next Monday, November 10th, St. Paul's College, Jansen Theater, 7 p.m. So how's that for a quick plug and advert? That was my advert break. Any other questions, please? Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Jasmine. Thank you so much for sharing some of your insights and knowledge and stories that we would not have otherwise heard. So I'm really grateful for them, thank you. Before COVID, I was working in Indigenous rights work. Since COVID, I've begun working in the settlement sector, and oof, it is unbelievable really what the people at the front line, the workers, the people who are managing all of the programming, of course your relationship is different, but you are also working with government who are holding specific powers, passes, eligibility checks for you to do your work. And so I really wonder about the workers of yourselves being in the humanitarian sector. How do you keep joy? How do you keep fun? How do you prevent yourselves from being champions who lead until exhaustion and then just burn out and fall away for a while? So I'd really love to learn from you, especially being within this work for so long. Thank you.
Thanks, Jasmine. Thanks for the question. I'm sure, Dalia, you'll have things to say. I can only speak for me personally, not for all workers in this sector. But for me, it's the advocacy part of Oxfam's work that really drives me, because there's a sense of desperation where you're at the front lines of life-saving response, where you feel like it's an endless cycle of pain and injustice. But having the privilege of leading an organization that is outspoken, that at its core speaks truth to power, is very energizing. We're really tackling the big picture issues. And sometimes it means, you have to stick with it for many years. There's not quick wins. But I think, Oxfam was one of the organizations that worked for many years, decades, to get a global arms trade treaty. But there's something incredible when you are able to see that treaty come to life, Canada accede to the treaty, and then you can hold the government accountable when there's violations. Say you sign this treaty, stop sending weapons to countries that are committing crimes against civilians. So that sense of being able to have a powerful voice in the face of injustice and to speak powerfully to those in power, it for me at least personally, it gives me lots of motivation and sense to the work.
How about you, Dalia?
It's very interesting that you mentioned the advocacy parts. My first full-time job was at the Advocacy Institute in Washington, D.C., and it's since been dissolved, but I remember the executive director telling me, you have to take the wins where you can get them. And even if you're losing by a little margin, that's still a win. And that is something I think that we forget in the humanitarian world because we don't get a lot of wins. Our work is a direct function of exactly that. There's a lot of ways to answer that, but I think the big part of it is, a lot of us in this work are driven by passion. We're driven by principle. And the fatigue that comes with the work, I think the exhaustion, the frustrations, a lot of times it's not exactly the work, it's actually the constraints that the work poses. It's the things that keep us from fulfilling our mission. Those are the things that wear us down, not the constant need, not knowing that there's another thing that needs to be done, there's another need that needs to be met, there's another family. And it's the same, I speak about it from the viewpoint of sitting in Toronto, but I also speak about it from the viewpoint of being a 15-year-old in a school that spent my weekends in refugee camps. There's no other way, you have to do it. I just can't imagine a world where you don't do it, and that's actually what drives a lot of our local partners and the first responders, whether they're our partners or not, is that there is a need, we respond. We don't sit around and wait for a green light, and yes, it drives people to exhaustion, and yes, there have been horrible outcomes, and burnout is a real thing. But there aren't a lot of people that willingly walk away because they've reached the limit. And for a lot of us, you can't separate us from the communities that are experiencing hardship.
When I hear you use words like passion, keeping you alive and driving you in your own work, I'm thinking of our own culture where we're driven more by pension, right? And we're so far from this reality. We're driven by pensions. But what a joy to hear you say something like, folks, do not burn out. Chase your passion, not your pension. And thank you for that reminder. Sir.
My name is Paul. I work with Canadian Food Grains Bank, which is another organization that does similar work to Oxfam. Thanks very much for highlighting the needs. However, we're often, I think, in Canada, pushed to compare those needs with the needs locally, right? Food prices are rising, healthcare is not as good as it should be, rents are rising, etc. And there's a number of political voices that would say, we can't afford to do that. Those people are outside Canada, they don't vote, let's forget about them. Let's not do anything. So besides highlighting the need, what are the motivations of why Canada should be involved? How do we talk to the public? How do we talk to politicians about the why?
Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. I've known Paul for several years. It's very nice to see you tonight. Before answering your question on the why, I want to say something on the how. We can absolutely afford to do both. We can afford to have a healthy and well-fed and well-educated Canadian population and be good global citizens. And there is one very easy solution, which is stopping tax evasion and fighting for tax justice, because we're not in a time of scarcity. There is incredible wealth in this country. Too much of it is not going to the common good. And so while that may seem far from a conversation on global forced displacement, I was mentioning Oxfam looks at the big drivers. We do a lot of advocacy on tax justice to say there are resources out there. If we weren't kind of giving a break to the most wealthy and were able to reinvest in society, we could feed people very well here at home and internationally. And so I think we need to be forceful about that. We are actually not in a time of scarcity. There is the billionaires in this country keep getting richer. There is a lot of wealth to go around. Now, how to speak to Canadians on these topics, I think rooting in justice, talking about justice, I think there's a lot of conversation today on what is in it for us, what is in kind of in our interest, and having too narrow of a self-interest discourse doesn't get you very far. I think those who believe in global solidarity will be turned off by the idea that we would only do things out of self-interest, and those who weren't interested in global solidarity won't be sold by the idea this is in our self-interest. I do think that holding on to values of justice are important. I think it resonates with a lot of people. If I look at, there's tens of thousands of people who donate to Oxfam every month, many of them $5 or $10 a month, not big donations. They're not donating to our work because they think that their individual life will be better. They see it as being part of a global society and wanting to do what's in the interest of our shared humanity. So I think that's important. That said, we need to be addressing the causes of displacement, and a lot of that has to do with investing in development work, investing in fighting the inequalities, the injustice that force people to flee. So obviously it's in Canada's interest to have a more stable, a more peaceful, a more prosperous world. Our Prime Minister keeps talking about trade. You can't trade with a country that's being torn apart by civil war, that's being battered by climate emergencies. So investing in stability, in a more in a calmer climate, all of that is in our collective self-interest, I guess, as humanity. But I wouldn't want our messages about these issues to be purely based on what's in it for us. That's part of it, but I also think that clinging to values of justice, equality, solidarity, these are things that still matter. And I do think that at their core, most people feel empathy for those who are suffering and want to express that. And I know that our current economic environment forces people to look inward, and populist politicians around the world are telling people that they should fend for themselves first. And I think that we can counter that with an emphasis on empathy and solidarity and justice.
Thank you. We'll have one more question, and Dalia, I'll get you to answer her question even before we hear that question.
Okay, my name is Asha Pereira, and I thank you very much for this presentation. I'm pretty sure we're, all like-minded people, or we wouldn't be here. But my question, and you kind of alluded to it, but tomorrow the Government of Canada will be releasing a budget, and they have been talking about drilling. It sounds like devastating the environment, in my opinion. They are talking about increasing spending to the military, which also seems like the opposite of what needs to be done. And they've, they have reduced the number of departments that are supporting women that had previously been in place. And I'm wondering, in your advocacy work, what are some of the things that Oxfam can do, and how can we as Canadians continue to spread and share that message? And I think you've answered some of it, but how can we counter what looks like, that government was elected to be the opposite of what is happening in the South, and yet so many of the policies look like they're mirror images of what's happening there. And how do we get that message across to people so that they aren't looking at themselves and their economic troubles and thinking that's the way to go?
I think I'll share this with Lauren too. But just on my end, one of the biggest messages that I talk about and that we talk about as international actors, as Oxfam, is that it's not a zero-sum game. And Paul, this goes back a little bit to your question as well, is that we can have things that are good, but we also, where we put our money reflects our choices, and it reflects what we're choosing to leave behind. And that is just the reality. And that's why we have all this work that we do in advocacy. That's why we focus on inequality. But maybe, Lauren, if you want to tell us a little bit more about specifically what we've been doing on women, because we saw the writing on the wall before it was very clear, and Oxfam's been doing a lot of work behind the scenes and also in front of the scenes, particularly on making sure that women continue to be in the forefront of the agenda here in Canada.
Sure. I definitely appreciate that question. And sometimes our advocacy at agenda at Oxfam seems very wide-ranging. I was talking about arms trade, tax justice, tax evasion, global aid, but it's because all of these things are connected, and I think it's helping people understand those connections. And showing how many of the struggles that we're facing here are some that are shared. For example, if you don't have adequate public services in your community, if you don't have access to a family doctor, it's because we're not investing enough in our public services, because the state is being robbed of resources that are being channeled towards the top and that could be redirected towards investing in the common good. That's very similar as a global dynamic, where some countries can invest in their own healthcare systems and education that would keep people home where they want to be, because those countries are being robbed by debt. They are having to pay back to capitals like London and Paris and in Ottawa, paying back debt that is unfair debt. So I think connecting the dots between tax justice, the global debt crisis that's keeping the poorest countries in the world trapped in debt. These are complicated conversations, but I think Canadians can understand them. And I think what Dalia was alluding to was a more domestic example, but Oxfam works on women's rights internationally and also here in Canada. And I was mentioning before that we know that societies are safer and happier and healthier when there's a strong women's movement, because that creates a foundation upon which communities can really thrive. And given all this scarcity mindset and the sense that we're heading into austerity era, we've been advocating very forcefully with our colleagues in the women's movement across the country to say Canada needs to continue investing in women's rights here at home. We can't put that aside. That is not a foundation for a prosperous economy and a safe country. And let's take the wins when they come. Last Wednesday, I was invited by the Minister of Finance, Champagne, for an announcement, and Canada announced that they were going to be investing $500 million in funding the women's movement in Canada. They made this as a pre-budget announcement. This is higher than pre-COVID levels, higher than Trudeau-era levels, so it's a significant amount of funding. Now, it's probably pennies compared to what we're going to be investing in military, and there's no amount of weapons that will buy our way to peace and security, I believe. But you know, that investment in the women's movement in Canada wouldn't happen if there hadn't been advocates speaking out, calling the ministers, you know, doing that advocacy work, mobilizing people across the country. And so last week, on Wednesday, we celebrated a win, and then tomorrow we get ready to speak out when needed against poor economic decisions when they're made. But you know, that's what fuels us.
Thank you, Lauren, Dalia. There's a lot shared today, and you use the language of advocacy. And what comes to mind, and I hope to bring this to a close with what I think I hear, what I'm hearing with you is advocacy is connected to this Latin word advocare, to be called towards, right? What are we being called towards, I hear you asking? What are we called to invest in? You said we put money, speaks to choices, but money also speaks to what we value. So what are we being called to, and what can we do in relation to addressing what we are collectively called to? And thank you so very much for coming out. Thank you so much for your honesty, your passion. At least I'll have another example to tell my students. I have met 2 individuals who are not chasing their pension. Thank you. And will you join me, please? And before you go, I'm going to invite 2 wonderful people from St. Paul's College and also one from Global College, University of Winnipeg. I'm going to ask Tanya Brothers and Dr. Shauna Lapman to come up. Tanya Brothers is on our board of directors for the Foundation of St. Paul's, and Shauna is the executive director at Global College. We have a small gift. Thank you. Thank you for coming out. And again, Women at the Heart of Justice, next week, St. Paul's College. If you're here, please come on down. And we'll stay around for a few minutes if you'd like to visit with our visitors and guests. Thank you. Thank you.